John Miller sat quietly at the dinner table, his hands clasped in front of him, staring at the half-empty plate. The once lively family dinners that had been a staple of their home now felt hollow. His wife, Emily, sat across from him, absently poking at her salad, her mind seemingly elsewhere. Their 12-year-old son, Ethan, was buried in his phone, eyes glued to the screen. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence deafening. John, a man who had once been confident, the kind of man others admired for his stability, intelligence, and charm, now felt like a stranger in his own home. He had built his life around his family, believing in the idea of a happy marriage and the American dream. Emily, his wife of 15 years, had been his partner, his confidant, the mother of their son. She was everything to him. But lately, something had shifted. It wasn't just the distance that had grown between them, but the coldness. Something was off, and John could feel it in his bones, but he couldn't place what had changed. Ethan, their son, had been the center of their universe for years. His bright smile, his mischievous laugh, it was all part of what made their family complete. But now, even Ethan seemed more distant, more attached to his phone than his parents. John couldn't help but notice the way his son would look at Emily when she smiled at her phone. A look that made his heart sink, a look that wasn't for him. 15 years ago, when John and Emily first met, everything had been perfect. They were two young dreamers, eager to take on the world together. They had met in college, both ambitious, both driven, and both seeking someone to share their lives with. Their love had been effortless, the kind of connection that people dream about but rarely find. John had been her rock, her safe place, and Emily had been the woman he'd wanted to build a future with. They got married 2 years after graduation, and the years that followed were filled with shared dreams and growing pains. John had worked tirelessly in his career, rising through the ranks to become a successful businessman. Emily, on the other hand, had stayed home with Ethan, ensuring he had everything he needed. There were occasional struggles, but their life felt stable, predictable, even. John had prided himself on being the provider, the protector. He had always been the type of man who could be counted on, both in his career and in his personal life. He believed that if you worked hard, kept your head down, and supported those you loved, everything would fall into place. But as the years passed, something changed. He started noticing the small shifts in Emily's behavior. She became more distant, more focused on her work, her hobbies, anything but him. She would spend hours on her phone, texting or scrolling through social media, while he sat beside her, longing for the connection they once shared. There were fewer intimate moments between them, fewer late-night conversations about their hopes and dreams. Slowly, John began to feel invisible. At first, he brushed it off, thinking it was just a phase, something that would pass. But as time wore on, the distance grew. The nagging feeling in his gut couldn't be ignored any longer. He began to question if Emily still loved him, if their marriage had become nothing more than a hollow shell of what it once was. It was one Tuesday afternoon when John's world came crashing down. He had come home early from work to surprise Emily. The day had been long and exhausting, and he had hoped to spend some quality time with his wife before Ethan came home from school. But when he entered the house, the sight he walked into was something he would never forget. Emily's voice echoed from the living room, laughing softly at something. But it wasn't the laughter of a woman speaking to her husband. No, this was different. This was a soft, intimate laugh, a laugh that belonged to someone else. John froze in the doorway, his heart sinking as he heard another voice in response. "Are you sure no one will find out?" the voice asked, filled with warmth. Emily's reply was whispered but unmistakable. "We've been careful. No one knows about us, and it needs to stay that way." John's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. The world seemed to spin around him as he slowly stepped forward, trying to make sense of what he had just overheard. Emily was having an affair. The betrayal was clear, but the pain of it hit him harder than he could have ever imagined. His hands trembled as he approached the living room. He stood at the entrance, watching Emily as she held the phone to her ear, her expression soft and content. The woman he loved was in the arms of another man, and he had no idea how long it had been going on. Ethan's voice drifted from the hallway, breaking the moment of stunned silence. "Dad, you're home early." John's mind snapped back to reality. He turned to his son, but his heart wasn't in it. He had just been betrayed in the most intimate way, and now, in this moment, he wasn't even sure who he was anymore. The feeling of betrayal hit John like a tidal wave. His stomach churned with a mixture of disbelief and deep sadness. He had spent years building his life around Emily, around their family, believing in the stability and love they had shared. He had sacrificed his time, his energy, his very soul to provide for them, to make sure they had everything they needed. And this was how she repaid him. In that moment, John felt small, insignificant. He had always seen himself as the strong, reliable husband, the man who could be counted on in any situation. But now, standing there, watching Emily smile at her lover's voice, John felt weak. How could he have missed it? How could he have been so blind to the cracks forming in their marriage? But it wasn't just Emily's betrayal that devastated him. It was the realization that he had let himself become complacent. He had allowed the passion, the connection they once had, to fade into the background. He had taken her for granted, and now he had lost her. As John stood there, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, something inside him began to shift. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the man he had become, the version of himself who had worked tirelessly, sacrificed everything for his family, only to have it crumble before him. He had allowed himself to become passive, to accept a life of mediocrity in his marriage, to rely on the stability of routine instead of nurturing the love he had once shared with Emily. John felt a fire ignite within him, a fire that had been dormant for far too long. He was no longer the man he had been. He didn't want to be the man who let life happen to him. He wanted to take control, to reclaim his strength and his pride. But he didn't know where to start. He didn't know who to turn to for guidance. As he stood in that room, still absorbing the shock of Emily's betrayal, one thing became clear. He was ready for a change. He would not remain a victim in his own life. If Emily no longer saw him as the man she married, then he would become the man she could never forget. A new version of himself, stronger, more confident, more alpha than he had ever been before. And so, it began. John Miller spent the next few days in a haze of confusion and pain. Each morning felt heavier than the last, as though his body was made of lead. He went through the motions, getting up, going to work, sitting through endless meetings. But none of it mattered. The world outside seemed distant, like it was happening to someone else. His mind kept returning to the same thing. Emily's betrayal, the whisper of her voice over the phone, the intimate laugh she shared with another man, the simple fact that his wife had chosen someone else over him. He couldn't escape the humiliation. Every time he walked into their home, his mind would replay that moment in the living room. Emily had looked so carefree, so happy. In his heart, John couldn't shake the feeling that she had been unfaithful for far longer than he had realized. The anger inside him grew, but it was mixed with a deep sadness that gnawed at him. How could he have been so blind? Why hadn't he noticed the warning signs earlier? He questioned his own worth, his own masculinity. Was he not good enough for her? Was he not the man she had once fallen in love with? John started to feel emasculated. His confidence, which had once been his greatest strength, was now shattered. He had always prided himself on being the strong, dependable one, the provider, the protector. Now, he felt weak. He had always been the one in control, the one who could fix things. But this was beyond fixing. The foundation of his life, his marriage, had been cracked wide open, and there was no way to repair it. He found himself withdrawing, not just from Emily, but from everyone. He couldn't bear the thought of being around his friends, his colleagues. Every smile felt like a mockery. They didn't know what he was going through. They didn't see the pain that was eating him alive from the inside. He could feel their judgment, even when they didn't say anything. He was the man whose wife had left him for another man. What kind of man was he? Meanwhile, Emily seemed unfazed by the emotional turmoil she had caused. She had, in her mind, justified her actions long before John had discovered the affair. For months, she had been sneaking around, hiding her relationship with her lover, Tom, from her husband. She had told herself that it was harmless, just a temporary escape from the monotony of her marriage. John had become predictable, stagnant. He no longer saw her, no longer made her feel desired. Tom, on the other hand, had made her feel alive again. He listened to her, laughed at her jokes, and made her feel beautiful in a way John hadn't in years. To Emily, it wasn't even about love. It was about validation. She had grown tired of being taken for granted. John was so wrapped up in his work, his responsibilities, that he had forgotten to show her that he still cared. And so, she sought solace in the arms of another man. She told herself that she deserved this, that it was John's fault for becoming complacent, for not noticing her growing discontent. In her mind, she was justified. Emily had never been one to face the consequences of her actions. Instead, she found ways to manipulate the situation to fit her narrative. When John confronted her, she played the victim, turning the tables to make him feel like the one at fault. "I needed more, John," she said one night, her voice trembling with false vulnerability. "I've been asking for more attention, more affection, for months. You just didn't see me anymore. I had no choice." In her twisted logic, she wasn't the bad guy. She was the woman who had been neglected, who had fallen out of love because her husband had failed to meet her needs. She wasn't trying to hurt him, she insisted. She was simply trying to survive. But as John listened to her words, the reality of her betrayal hit him even harder. It wasn't just the affair. It was the way she had spun it, the way she had made him feel small, unworthy, as if everything that had gone wrong in their marriage was his fault. As if the situation wasn't painful enough, John's son, Ethan, began to pull away as well. At first, John thought it was just a phase. Ethan had always been a typical teenager, aloof and focused on his friends. But now, the distance between them felt intentional, like there was something more behind it. The silence in their conversations grew, and John began to notice the subtle changes in his son's behavior. Ethan would often disappear into his room for hours, only emerging when he needed something. But what stung the most was the way Ethan seemed to gravitate toward Emily. She had always been the more nurturing parent, but now, it was as if Ethan saw her as his only ally. John couldn't understand it. Hadn't he been the one to raise his son, to provide for him, to teach him right from wrong? Why was Ethan so loyal to Emily? Why was he turning away from him? One evening, John overheard a conversation between Ethan and Emily. His son, unaware that John was listening, had confided in her about his growing resentment toward his father. "He's always so angry lately, Mom. I don't know what's wrong with him. It's like he's not the same guy I used to look up to." John's heart shattered. His son had turned his back on him. He had become the person his son no longer trusted, the father who had failed him. The weight of this new reality crushed John. He wasn't just losing his wife. He was losing his son as well. The man who had once been the center of Ethan's world was now the source of his pain. John could feel the walls closing in around him. He was alone. The isolation John felt was not limited to his family. The world outside his home seemed to be judging him as well. At work, he could feel the eyes on him, the whispers behind his back. He had once been the confident leader, the man who had everything together. Now, he was the man whose wife had cheated on him, the man who couldn't keep his own family intact. The shame was unbearable. Even his closest friends, the ones who had always been there for him, now seemed distant. When they spoke to him, their words felt hollow, as if they pitied him. No one knew what to say, and John couldn't bring himself to open up. He had always been the strong one, the one who helped others. But now, he was the one in need, and he didn't know how to ask for help. At family gatherings, John couldn't escape the uncomfortable stares from relatives. Some tried to be supportive, offering empty words of encouragement, while others simply avoided the subject altogether. But John knew what they were thinking. They all knew about Emily's affair. They all knew about his failure as a husband, and it made him feel like he didn't belong in his own family, in his own skin. One sleepless night, John found himself staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He could no longer live in this state of turmoil, of self-doubt. The weight of his emotions, the betrayal, the shame, it was suffocating. But in that darkness, something shifted. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel the rawness of his pain. He had been avoiding it, numbing it with work and isolation, but now he couldn't deny it any longer. John knew he couldn't continue down this path. He couldn't let himself become a victim of his own life. He had spent too long believing that he was powerless, that the situation was beyond his control. But the truth was, he was still in charge of his own fate. He wasn't just a passive player in his own story. He could choose to change. He could choose to reclaim his life. As he lay there, the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. He didn't need Emily to validate his worth. He didn't need his son's approval to feel like a man. He had been so consumed by his role as a provider, as a husband, that he had forgotten who he truly was. It was time to rediscover himself, to find his strength again. It was time to stop being the man who had everything but lost it all. It was time to be the man who took control and became the best version of himself. Not for Emily, not for Ethan, but for John. The days of brooding were over. John had spent weeks drowning in self-pity, but it all came to a screeching halt one night, when he could no longer bear the weight of his own thoughts. He looked in the mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. The man in the reflection seemed weak, defeated, and fragile. His once muscular frame had softened from stress and sleepless nights. His shoulders slouched, as though carrying an invisible weight he could no longer ignore. The image that met him wasn't just a reflection. It was his life in its most broken form. John's breaking point came when he saw Emily, yet again, laughing with Tom. They were sitting in their living room, oblivious to his presence, as if nothing had changed. The sound of their laughter sliced through the stillness, like a cruel reminder of everything John had lost. He had been patient. He had been passive. But now, the grief and betrayal had crystallized into a burning rage that he couldn't suppress any longer. That night, John lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, letting the anger slowly build. He had allowed himself to wallow in his pain for far too long, but now, something within him had snapped. No more. No more would he let himself be a passive observer in his own life. No more would he allow Emily's infidelity or his son's rejection to define him. It was time for him to fight back, not against them, but against the man he had become. He had spent his entire life living for others, trying to please everyone. Now, it was time to live for himself. With that realization came clarity. John swore to transform himself, not for revenge, not for approval, but because he deserved more than what he had been settling for. He deserved to be the man he had once been, the man who was confident, strong, and self-respecting. He was no longer going to be the man who bowed to others' expectations or played the role of the victim. This was his life, and it was time to reclaim it. John's transformation didn't just happen mentally. The next morning, he woke up early, determined to take action. He started with the basics, a morning jog. It wasn't much, but it was the first step in reclaiming his body and mind. Every muscle in his body screamed with protest, but he pushed through. He could feel the sweat, the burn, and with each step, he felt the old version of himself slowly returning. It wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about doing something for himself, taking control of the one thing he could control, his body. For the next several weeks, John made it a point to wake up before dawn every day. He ran, lifted weights, and ate better. His body began to change, but so did his mindset. As he grew stronger physically, he started to feel the strength returning to his mind. With every weight he lifted, he felt the burden of his past life drop off, little by little. Each bead of sweat was a release, each rep a step toward his own rebirth. John started dressing differently too. Gone were the frumpy, oversized clothes that had once represented the man he had been. A man who had given up on his own identity. Now, he wore clothes that fit him well, clothes that made him feel powerful. The physical transformation was not just about looking good. It was about feeling good, about showing the world that he was no longer the man he had been, the man who let everyone walk over him. He was stepping into his power, step by step. His newfound confidence was palpable. He held himself taller, spoke with more authority, and exuded an energy he hadn't felt in years. People around him started noticing the change. His coworkers complimented him on his appearance. His friends remarked on his improved mood. Even Ethan, though still distant, couldn't help but notice the change in his father. John had become someone he could respect again. Not someone who was lost in sadness, but someone who was taking charge of his life. One evening, when John walked into their home, he found Emily and Tom once again in the living room, this time exchanging tender looks, completely oblivious to his presence. He could feel the anger rising inside him, but this time, it wasn't the anger of a man who had been betrayed. It was the anger of a man who had finally woken up to the reality of his own worth. He walked into the room, his footsteps deliberate, and they both looked up, their faces going pale. The silence was thick with tension. "John," Emily started, standing up quickly, her hand going instinctively to her throat. "No," he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I need to talk to both of you. Now." There was no avoiding it. Emily and Tom had thought they had everything under control, but John was no longer the same man who would sit silently and suffer. He was a man who had found his strength again, and he was going to take back his life. "Tom," John said, his eyes locking onto the man who had been the catalyst for this upheaval in his life. "You've taken something from me that you'll never understand. You think you've won, but you've only proven how weak you really are." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but John held up a hand to silence her. He wasn't interested in her excuses anymore. He wasn't interested in hearing her justifications for what she had done. He had heard it all before. Now, it was time for him to speak. "You've made your choices, Emily," he said, his voice unwavering. "And now I'm making mine. I'm done being the man who always gave in, who always sacrificed himself for the sake of a family that didn't appreciate it. I'm done being the man who cowers in the corner, too afraid to stand up for myself. I've spent too long pretending. I'm done pretending to be something I'm not." The room felt like it was closing in, but John's words pierced the tension like a knife. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but John wasn't moved by her tears anymore. He had no more room in his heart for her pity. He had given enough of himself, and now, it was time for him to take back what was his dignity, his self-respect, and his identity. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I'm not doing this for you," he said over his shoulder, his words heavy with finality. "I'm doing this for me." As John left the house, the weight of what he had just done began to sink in. He had not only confronted Emily and Tom, but he had confronted himself. He had realized that this moment, this emotional showdown, wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing them for what they had done to him. It was about reclaiming his power and his life. This was not about them. It was about him. The man he was becoming was someone who would no longer allow himself to be defined by betrayal. John realized that the true strength he had been seeking all along wasn't in getting back at Emily or making her feel sorry for what she had done. It wasn't in winning his son's approval or gaining sympathy from his coworkers. True strength came from within, being the best version of himself, regardless of how others treated him. He had spent so much time trying to please everyone, to be everything to everyone, that he had forgotten the most important thing. He needed to be everything for himself. He walked into the night with his head held high. His journey of transformation had just begun, but for the first time in months, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because he had taken control. John's physical transformation had been swift, but the emotional consequences of his decisions were more complicated, lingering in his thoughts long after the dust had settled. As he stared into the mirror each morning, he could no longer see the man he had been, the man who had bowed his head and quietly absorbed the blows of betrayal. He could only see the man he had chosen to become, the one who had taken control of his life, the one who had fought for his own identity. But the mirror reflected more than just muscles and a sharper jawline. It reflected a man at war with himself. Was he proud of what he had become? He should have been, but pride came with a price. The strength he had fought so hard to reclaim had come at a cost. The loss of his family, his old sense of self, and the isolation he now felt weighed heavily on his conscience. For the first time in years, he felt conflicted. Was this the man he was meant to be? Or had he simply traded one form of submission for another? John had spent so much of his life trying to please everyone that he never stopped to ask himself what he wanted. Now, he had become a man who followed no one's orders, except his own. But was this new, stronger version of himself better? Or had he sacrificed too much in the pursuit of self-respect? He sat at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair, trying to understand the emotional landscape he had created. He had stood up for himself. He had fought back. But in the silence of his home, with only his own thoughts to keep him company, he couldn't help but wonder, had it all been worth it? The answer was unclear. His body had become stronger, but his heart felt heavier. Had his transformation been about his own growth, or had it been a reaction to the wounds inflicted by those he loved most? John's relationship with Emily had, predictably, taken a significant turn. After their confrontation, she had retreated, withdrawing emotionally and physically. Her eyes, once filled with defensive anger, now appeared resigned. She no longer engaged in the constant justifications that had fueled her affair. Instead, there was a heaviness in her silence. The confrontation had shaken her, but it had also created a rift between them that seemed impossible to mend. Emily's apology, when it came, was strained. She had broken down in front of him, her voice trembling as she confessed that she regretted the affair. "I never meant to hurt you, John," she said, her eyes searching his face for some sign that he could forgive her. But John didn't respond immediately. He had no easy answers, no simple way to make her pain go away. The old John might have embraced her with open arms, offering forgiveness in exchange for the illusion of peace. But the man sitting in front of her was no longer that man. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said quietly, the weight of the words heavier than he had expected. "I've changed, and I'm not sure if I can go back to what we were." Emily's face fell. She could sense it in his tone, the finality in his words. She had wanted him to return to the version of himself that had silently endured the pain of her betrayal, the man who had been content to be her emotional caretaker. But that man was gone. In the days that followed, Emily's attempts to reconnect felt more like attempts to regain control than genuine gestures of reconciliation. She would leave small notes around the house, apologizing again, trying to explain that her affair had been a mistake. But John no longer found comfort in her words. The warmth he once sought in their relationship had been replaced by cold, calculated distance. He knew that nothing she could say would undo what had been done. As for Ethan, the situation was even more complicated. The son who had once idolized him now seemed to view his father with skepticism, even resentment. Ethan's loyalty to Tom, who had become a near-father figure in his eyes, was clear. The dynamic between father and son had shifted irrevocably. No longer was John the hero in Ethan's life. He was the man who had been dethroned by his own inadequacy. The conversations between father and son, once filled with laughter and camaraderie, now carried an undertone of bitterness. Ethan no longer reached out for his father's approval or affection. Instead, he turned to Tom, who had become a surrogate father, someone who appeared strong and sure of himself, qualities that John had never embodied in Ethan's eyes. One night, Ethan stood in the kitchen, his back to John. "You've changed," he said, his voice cold and distant. "I don't know who you are anymore." John opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had changed, and that fact hung between them like a chasm that couldn't be bridged. John had fought so hard to rebuild himself, to become the man who could no longer be ignored, the man who no longer accepted betrayal or disrespect. But as the days wore on, the price of his newfound strength became more apparent. He no longer feared confrontation, but with that came a new kind of loneliness. He was stronger, yes. He had become someone who could stand up for himself. But in doing so, he had alienated the people he had once held dear. Was this the cost of self-respect? To be isolated from his family, from the people he loved most? There were nights when John lay awake, his thoughts swirling with doubt. He had won, in many ways, but had he lost everything in the process? His relationship with Emily was fractured, and his bond with Ethan seemed beyond repair. And yet, he couldn't deny the satisfaction he felt when he looked in the mirror. He had reclaimed his power, but now, he was left to question whether that power had come at the expense of his authenticity. His friends noticed the change too. Some admired his newfound confidence, congratulating him for turning his life around. But others seemed uncomfortable, as if they couldn't quite place the man he had become. They had known him as the quiet, reliable guy who always took the back seat. Now, he was a man who demanded attention, who took control of every situation. Some admired it, while others recoiled. The people around John reacted in ways he hadn't anticipated. His co-workers, once dismissive of him, now saw him in a new light. He had become a force to be reckoned with. No longer the man who quietly accepted their criticism, but a leader who took charge in meetings, spoke his mind, and commanded respect. But there was also an underlying tension. Some people resented this new version of John, unsure of how to interact with him now. It was as if they had expected him to remain in his old role, and the shift left them uneasy. Even his family friends reacted differently. Some of them, the ones who had witnessed his decline, now looked at him with admiration. They were impressed by the transformation, but there was an unspoken barrier. They didn't know how to approach the new John, the one who didn't take shit from anyone. As the weeks passed, John's internal conflict deepened. He had made the decision to change, but now, he questioned whether the change was truly for the better. Was this version of himself the one he had always wanted to be? Or had he simply replaced one mask with another? There were moments when he longed for the simplicity of his old life, when he had been content with quiet mediocrity, when he hadn't been forced to confront his own darkness. There were moments when he missed the familiar, even if it had been painful, because it had been comfortable. But comfort had never brought him the strength he now possessed. And despite the internal struggle, John couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the price of transformation. Perhaps the price of reclaiming his life was this isolation, this uncertainty. Perhaps it was worth it after all. John stood in the quiet of his bedroom, looking out the window at the world that seemed so familiar, yet so distant. The transformation he had undergone, physically, emotionally, and mentally, had been nothing short of seismic. In the mirror, he no longer recognized the weak man who had once struggled to hold his family together, the one who had quietly accepted the betrayals, the one who had believed that submission to others would somehow keep the peace. That man was gone, replaced by someone new, someone strong, confident, and in control. But now, standing in the aftermath of that transformation, John felt the weight of his choices. The change had been necessary, he realized. But it had come at a cost that was more than just the loss of his old self. It had come with the fracturing of his family. He had gained strength, yes, but had he lost his humanity in the process? He thought of Emily. She had apologized, but the rift between them had deepened to the point of no return. Her apologies had been like hollow words falling into the vast space between them, trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap. What had started as a betrayal had ended in silence. John realized that there was no going back to the life they had once known. They were two different people now, living in parallel lives that no longer intersected in any meaningful way. He had built walls around himself, walls that no one could scale, not even the woman he had loved for so long. He thought of Ethan, his son, who had once idolized him but now seemed like a stranger. Ethan's loyalty had shifted, and John couldn't help but wonder if the damage to their relationship was permanent. His son had turned to Tom, a man who had been there when John had failed, when John had been too passive, too broken. Would Ethan ever look at him with respect again? Would he ever trust him as a father? Or had the damage been done? Had the bridge been burned? And yet, despite the heaviness in his chest, despite the isolation that now surrounded him, John couldn't help but feel a flicker of something else: peace. He had faced his demons, reclaimed his power, and taken control of his life in a way he never had before. The internal battle was over. He was no longer the passive, beaten man he had been. He was stronger, more capable, but he had paid the price for that strength, an emotional toll that would echo in his heart for years to come. John took a deep breath, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. Maybe this was the man I needed to become. But who I was before, was he still a part of me? John's journey had taken him through the darkest corners of his own psyche, confronting his deepest fears, his shame, and his anger. He had sought strength in the form of physical transformation, but now, as he stood on the other side of it, he realized that the strength he had gained wasn't just about muscles or an alpha mentality. True strength lay in the ability to accept the consequences of his choices, to forgive himself for the mistakes he had made, and to move forward with a deeper understanding of who he was. It was not about being an alpha male in the toxic sense of the word, a man who dominated others or used his power to manipulate. It was about being strong enough to set boundaries, to fight for his dignity, and to stand tall, even when the world seemed against him. Strength, he realized, wasn't about controlling others. It was about controlling himself. His thoughts wandered back to the conversations he had with Emily. They had been difficult, raw, and uncomfortable, but in those moments, John had come to understand something crucial. He didn't need her validation to feel whole. He could move forward without her. And though the thought stung, he had to acknowledge it. Sometimes, walking away from the people you love the most was the only way to protect your own soul. It was the same with Ethan. As much as he had wanted to be the father his son admired, he couldn't force that love, that respect, back into existence. Ethan had chosen his own path, one that didn't include John at its center. And as much as John wished it were different, he knew that sometimes people had to find their way on their own terms. His son had to discover his own identity, separate from John's shadow. John had spent too many years of his life trying to fix things, to mold the people around him into versions that would make him happy. But now, he realized that true peace came from accepting people for who they were and allowing them to be who they needed to be. He had to accept the changes in himself and the changes in his relationships, no matter how painful they might be. There was one last conversation to have, one that he see identity, separate from John's shadow, to void any longer. Emily had reached out one final time, asking to meet. John had agreed, but he wasn't sure what to expect. He had no illusions about reconciliation. That ship had sailed, but he knew that for both of them, the closure would be necessary. They met at the same cafe where they had shared so many conversations in the past, back when everything had seemed so certain, back when they had been a family. Now, sitting across from her, John felt like a different man. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't even seeking her apology. He simply needed to let go, to stop holding on to a version of their relationship that could never exist again. "I'm sorry," Emily said softly, her voice trembling as she reached across the table. "I know I hurt you. I've hurt you more than I can ever fix." John looked at her hand, then back into her eyes. There was no malice in her gaze, no manipulation, just pain, raw and vulnerable. But John didn't reach for her. Instead, he took a deep breath and nodded. "I know you are. But I've changed, Emily. I can't go back to who I was." She seemed to understand, and in that moment, John felt a quiet, final acceptance settle over him. Their marriage had ended long before this moment. What they had once shared was irretrievably lost. And that was okay. In the days that followed, John felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The relationships he had lost weren't easily replaced, and the family he had known was forever changed. But there was something else now, something that had been buried beneath the pain and the anger. Hope. He had fought for his independence, and in doing so, he had learned that he didn't need the approval of others to validate his worth. His self-worth was his own to define. He wasn't sure what the future held, whether he would rebuild his relationship with Ethan or find a new sense of connection with someone else. But he knew one thing. He would move forward. He would continue to grow, to redefine himself in ways he had never imagined. He would live for himself, not for anyone else's expectations. As he walked down the street one afternoon, feeling the sun warm on his face, he saw the world differently. It was no longer a place where he needed to seek validation or approval. It was a place where he could take control of his own destiny, where he could be the man he was meant to be, imperfect, but free. John's story wasn't one of easy answers or perfect resolutions. It was a journey of self-discovery, of realizing that strength wasn't about domination or control, but about vulnerability and self-acceptance. It was about understanding that to truly love others, he had to first love himself. And in that journey, he had learned that love was not about power, but about understanding, respect, and the willingness to grow. The path he had chosen had led him to places he never expected, but he couldn't regret it. He had lost some things, but he had also gained a deeper sense of self, a self that was no longer defined by others, but by the choices he had made. As John stood on the precipice of his new life, there was one thing he knew for sure. The future was his to create. And it was up to him to decide what kind of man he would be. The answer, he realized, lay not in the strength of his body, nor in the alpha role he had tried to play, but in the quiet strength of his heart.